Thank you very much for the invitation to have this talk about one of my favorite topics, actually, practices of data use in schools. I have done a lot of work on this topic, starting actually with my PhD when I started it in 2004-2005 at the University of Oslo. And back then, Norway or Norwegian education authorities actually introduced national testing for the first time, and also a national quality assessment system in Norway. So I have, through my work, followed this development in the Norwegian context, and I've also been part of several projects on data use and also studied research trends on data use internationally. So my key topics for this talk is, first of all, I want to address what do we actually mean with data use or data use practices. And then I would quickly look into what kind of trends can be identified in international research on data use. And I think this is also important to understand practices of data use as a kind of emerging field over many years now. Then I want to focus a little bit on an empirical study in the Norwegian context, where we studied what kind of knowledge sources do teachers use when they kind of in meetings frame solutions to problems. And they then use and interact with data. And then in the end, I want to address some consequences in terms of what kind of conditions we create for learning and development in schools. So when it comes to data use, we have over the last, since 2000, this belief has grown stronger that data can be used to change practice. But when we look at the education policies in various countries, how this is supposed to happen, how to use data is very often described in vague ways. And to link a little bit to Ellen's presentation. So when I talk about data, this is then, as Ellen also presented, it's one ingredient in feedback. So this is often, as Ellen said, data-based or evidence-based. So this can be one ingredient. And when we talk about data, we often talk about student performance data, or data from different types of evaluations. But very often we talk about student performance data as measured by standardized tests. And I think when I enter or talk about this, I think it's important that we are aware of that data cannot objectively decide or guide decisions in any way. So we, as actors in the system, school actors, they decide on what data they, on how they decide on improvement. This means that the school actors, they select information, data sources to the degree that they actually can select. Maybe this is in some context also given what kind of data sources they're supposed to use. And this is often the case with performance data. But school actors then also negotiate what kind of problems they identify and how they can also solve them using the data. And there are many definitions of data use practices. I built here on Cynthia Coburn. She said actually that data use implies that the teachers, school leaders, I call them school actors, interact with data, but also with other colleagues using the data. And as Coburn and Turner here in a publication from 2011, they emphasize that data use implicates processes, conditions, and contexts. Actually, school actors, they interpret the data and they construct implications for the next step. So the solutions or improvement efforts are not given. And we also have to be aware of, which I have highlighted, data use also involves power relations. This is also connected to that they are used for accountability purposes. If we look at the different trends in research, there are many reviews in this field, and I have listed some of them here. And they address different factors that are important when school actors use data. For instance, organizational factors, access to time, data, interaction, the role of leadership, the engagement of school leaders in framing and making time for school actors to get involved with data. It also, for instance, Judith Little, she emphasizes that we need to translate data into more practical knowledge. And there are various other reviews here that emphasize factors that are important for data use. In 2014, we started a big project in Norway about exploring local practices of data use. We did it in municipalities and also in schools. And we are Tine Preid Sølvemøys Tage and myself. And at the start of this project, we also did a review in this area. And we looked not only into the English-speaking literature, but also the German-speaking and literature in Scandinavian languages. And you see here also a timeline, how the peaks are in the different languages when we do research on data use. And in this article that we also published on the basis of this, we see that there are different modes of investigation when it comes to the different language tradition in this area. For instance, we find that the English-speaking or more studies conducted in England or America are more oriented towards improving schools with the use of data. So more like they explore empirical studies exploring the use of data to improve. And in the German context, because they were later into this field of testing, they came later to testing, the topics in research are more pro or against. Is this really something we should get involved in? And they problematize standardized testing and discuss it. In the Scandinavian languages, the topics are more, they are characterized by the newness of this topic at this time, and there are more critical studies problematizing consequences for the teaching profession, for students, and so on, if we focus too much on performance data. Recently, I started to look into this literature again after 2014. And together with a PhD student from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Julia Montefiore, we have so far in our work, this is work in progress, identified that there are many English-speaking studies now exploring school actors' perceptions of data use, but also how teachers and school leaders can or how they develop their competencies to use data in terms of data literacy. And there are also studies trying to measure school actors' data literacy. So these are three emerging themes that we see in the research, body of research after 2014. With this as a kind of background, I want now to move into how teachers negotiate, how they interact with data, and how they use data to develop their own work. And what we found, we have here a model that we developed and analyzed based on an analysis of observations. So we observed so-called result meetings. So in the Norwegian context, many schools and municipalities, they have established a new routine after having more access to more performance data. So this routine is called result meeting. And they are established on various levels in the local school system. And we then went into and observed the result meetings about for teachers, how they interact with data, also with their school leader. And what we found, we have here based our analysis on 12-hour observations, and we found kind of 134 times that teachers actually addressed different types of knowledge sources that were tied to development or improvement effort. And interestingly, we found that there are a lot of practical experiences that teachers draw on as a knowledge source, or knowledge about the school context or context of various students in the classroom, also about relationships with students or how students relate together. And we found also subject knowledge and didactics. These are knowledge sources about this stippled line here that are used, connected to concrete efforts to improve or develop practice. And what we also found in their discussion is that the knowledge sources that I put below this stippled line here, performance data, student national test data, other types of statistics, research, something we have referred to as knowledge synthesis, because we have a center in the Norwegian context established a few years ahead of our research that sort of make knowledge synthesis of different types of research that are more accessible for practitioners. And these knowledge sources below the stippled line are more information that the teachers use to legitimate their decisions in their discussion. And what we discussed after this is that these sources below the stippled line are more abstract, more external, perceived as external knowledge sources to the teachers, while the knowledge sources above the stippled line are knowledge that they partly generate themselves. So it's easier for them to use this type of knowledge sources to improve or develop their practice. We also tried to sort of quantify the use of these type of knowledge sources. And you see that research is to a very little degree used, and there is practical experiences and subject didactics. This actually was very different for us to divide between, because they're used in connection. So we had to put these two categories together. And you see there are lots of use of performance data and statistics, but more than to legitimate decisions. So there are various quality circles that I use. This is one used in the Norwegian policy, and I'm sure that you in your country context have also various quality circles that you use for development purposes. So in this quality circle in the Norwegian context, it's very much about collect and use various information or resource, and then based on that set target, plan measures, implement measures, and then it starts again to collect and use different information. And what we saw in our research through the observations is that when teachers, I'm sure you're aware of this single double loop learning model from Argyris and Schön, and there are various ways of illustrating this model. So what we found was that when the teachers use the performance data, they tend to we characterize this as a kind of thin data use, because they just, if everything is going well, they say, okay, this is good. You clap yourself on the shoulder and we move on with the same. So then you have kind of a single loop that are used. And you do more of the same, it works fine. And what we witnessed is that this kind of, in order to create this kind of double loop, it's very much needed that the school leaders also address other questions and not only deal with the performance data. So why I want to raise this model is that I think we need to be aware what kind of conditions that we create for learning and development when we make use of different data sources, and that we also take the time to address more values or underlying assumptions. What are the best for developed student learning and other types of topics that are not only in this quick improvement circle. So if we come to a summary, I think we can say that we have very much a confidence in performance data and student outcomes as a basis of governing schools and developing quality in education. And in certain ways, at least from a Norwegian perspective, Scandinavian perspective, performance data very much set the premises for local, regional, and also national development projects. And I think this is due to it provides a very strong legitimation to do for the different efforts or approaches that you would like to initiate. And I really think with my second last slide here that the increased awareness is needed with respect to what kind of learning and development we want. Because if we focus too much on performance data, this will also be the source for further improvement. And there are so many other aspects of student learning, of school quality that also need to be addressed. And I should also mention, related to the research field on data use, you could say that this is linked to very much theories about school improvement or school development. It could also be linked to feedback, as Ellen talked about. But in the data use literature is, to the extent I've seen until now, very little theory-led. So this is also an important characteristics of this type of literature and of the research, and maybe also the practice of using the data. I also want to say that in the end now, the data, they are really fascinating. You know, you have numbers that you can use to compare across contexts, local, national, and also used for different types of purposes, and they're quite powerful. And they also appear to provide neutral and objective information. And this maybe needs to be questioned a bit more, because research has also emphasized that data needs contextualization. It also needs kind of translation as part of feedback in order to help students and teachers and school actors to improve. It's also a question if we have data overload, if you think of all the data sources that we are expected to be used. And in the end, it's also that much of the data are provided by standardized testing. And together with a colleague in Sweden, Linda Rönnberg, and a colleague in Denmark, Christian Idsen, we analyzed policy across the Scandinavian countries, and we found that in the policy, it seems also that the standardized testing is more than solution to known problems. And we found examples that kind of standardized testing expands its area, and it appears to be able to solve also other policy problems, for instance, gender differences and various problems in education policies. With this, I want to thank you very much for your attention.